Good morning. Now this session, explanation about the Buddha Dharma. So I'm extremely happy. We have Buddhist brothers, sisters from different Buddhist countries. First in Mongolia, then I think from Sri Lanka, then Korea,
Thailand.
Thai, that's right. And Chinese?
Korea.
You Chinese? No. So, the Buddhists from Sri Lanka and Thailand, they are the practitioner of Pali tradition. So that is the foundation of Buddha Dharma. And among Buddhist follower, the holder of Pali tradition or the elder. So my respect. Then Sanskrit tradition is concerned, Chinese Buddhist, and then Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and Tibet and Mongolia. So among them, the Chinese tradition or Chinese, the Sanskrit tradition holder, Chinese Buddhist holder of Sanskrit tradition are senior. So then we Tibetan are youngest, only after 7th century. Mongolia's case, I heard first the Buddhism reached Mongolia perhaps before reaching Tibet, first one. Then second and third, then Buddhism come from Tibet. So today's Buddha Dharma, which practicing by Mongolian, does come from Tibet. So for Tibetan case, Indians are our guru. In the Mongolians case, we are their guru. So now basically the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, two traditions. The Sanskrit tradition, the Pali tradition also they also take.
No.
So some kind of, I think, combine Pali tradition as a foundation, then Sanskrit tradition. In the Sanskrit tradition, I think Buddhist logics maybe, I think, develop much stronger in the
Extensively.
More extensive in the Sanskrit tradition. Then also the Buddhist Tantrayana, Buddhist Tantric, also then I think in Sanskrit tradition, Buddhist Tantrayana also much
is present. No.
So then Tibetan tradition since Tibetan tradition, which is started after Nalanda, famous Nalanda tradition, well established in India. Therefore, Tibetan tradition, actually the pure lineage of Nalanda tradition. That's very clear. All those major texts of Buddhism, mainly Sanskrit and some Pali, which we learned
Study.
by heart from young age. Rimshi Thama Pecha Lunzin Shidu Gol Kazare. Pecha Thama Lunzin Shidu Gol Kazare. Pecha Pecha Simdu. Ha. Changase. Oh. His case, around 14, 15 years, start with learning. My case, about 6, 7 years, very young, I started learning by heart. At that time, no interest. Almost like burden. So in daily time, when my tutor come, that almost
I used to feel almost as if the sun was setting and getting darker.
So such a student is really, let's say, I think, I always prefer play like that. So maybe stupid student. So my point is, all those texts which we learned by heart, all wrote by Nalanda masters. So it is quite clear. And then later, we study commentaries of these root texts. So Tibetan Buddhism, I usually describe the Theravada tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, including Buddhist Tantrayana tradition, all complete. So that's Nalanda tradition. Like one of top, or say, the scholar, as well as the Buddhist master, Nagarjuna, he himself, wrote Tantrayana, and of course, Madhyamika philosophy. Madhyamika philosophy, I think something like combined with logics. So Nagarjuna, one of the top scholar of the Nalanda, is logician, also philosopher, also very good Buddhist monk, then also physicians, and also some kind of chemistry.
Also a kind of a chemist as well.
So we can, I think, consider him as a, at that time, sort of what's a scientist. So his brain is really brilliant. In his writing, he make very precise sort of the distinction. Certain Buddha's word, which he found contradictory with logical reason, then he rejected these things. Then only those texts which logically can prove, then he accepts these are the
These are definitive statements of the Buddha.
Because Buddha himself is made clear that my follower accept my teaching not out of respect, but rather your own investigation and experiment. So he make very clear some kind of liberty to investigate Buddha's own word. Because the Buddha taught different philosophies due to among his followers there are different mental disposition. Therefore, he deliberately teach different philosophy or different concept, which itself contradictory. So sometimes I jokingly telling audience, this contradictory philosophy taught by Buddha, one Buddha, same teacher, certainly it is certainly not due to his own confusion, certainly not, nor he deliberately create confusion among his student, certainly not. Then why he taught is in these different philosophy, contradictory philosophy? The answer is there are different sort of mental disposition, mental capacity in different karmic propensities.
No. There are differences among the individual's karmic propensities.
So this very helpful to look other tradition, non-Buddhist tradition. Yes, there are people who may not find Buddhist approach is suitable. So we need different approach, different way of approach, according different mental disposition of people at different location, different time. So this very helpful, to develop the accept of pluralism of religions is very useful. So Tibetan tradition, in some time ago, I mean the early part of the 20th century, some scholar described Tibetan Buddhism as not genuine Buddhism, but something deviated. Right?
No, deviant. No.
And called
degenerate.
Lama.
Degenerate form of Buddhism.
Degenerate of Buddhism, which called Lamaism. I think that is, expression or description of lack of knowledge. So usually, I always telling or introduce Tibetan Buddhism is pure tradition of Nalanda institution. Then, meanwhile, I also want to say, in 8th century, the one of top logicians as well as a philosopher or master of Nalanda came to Tibet. His name Shantarakshita. He, I think, encouraged Tibetan emperor, now you Tibetan should should hold Buddha Dharma through your own language. So it is much better translate. In Mongolia's case, now for example, through centuries, although they have their own language, their own script, but they prefer, you see, study with Tibetan language. Right? In Tibet case, they, I think really, because of the broad-minded or wise or far-sighted, yes, far-sighted. I think both Tibetan emperor and mainly, I think the Nalanda, this particular sort of scholar, he advised all those texts should translate into Tibetan. So at Samya monastery, there's suppose I think first monastery is a Buddhist monastery in Tibet. Actually, that monastery, it said the construction of that monastery carried under the instruction of Shantarakshita. So there are different departments. One department for translation, one department for the meditation, one department for Vinaya Kasoda,
a monastic discipline,
and start taking monk's vow. So first time, 8th century, under that master's leadership. Another department, like more ritual or ceremony, or Tamsian. And of course, meantime, the Pema Sambhava also there. He carry, I think his direct responsibility is to eliminate all the negative forces of Buddha Dharma. And meantime, he also used to carry some tantric teaching. So eventually, Tibetan language now today, I think up to now, Tibetan language is the one of the almost the best language among the translations of original Sanskrit
text.
Sanskrit text. So in 20th century, some Western scholars, they found Tibetan translations are very authentic, accurate. Now, now only 1 hour. So I don't know how to start actual explanation about the Buddha Dharma. Perhaps now I switch Tibetan language. The Shijing Doi Tsikshare, Lekjagda Tsik, similar, sim machide, sim Jiranshin, Versao Sachi, the Tubusumche, similar Sadigi, Maranzu, Samaloda, Didu saw Shuksum Sachi Yari, Didu saw the semi Pembucha Gana Yamari, Sim Dankana Yari. 자자가 시바도 저희들이 근데 인도 치세미 뱀변 내주사 뭐임 봐 nang sheba se di modu tona sheba sheba yare semla ta dewa de dongye se di tartu na sim tu mo tu ge ne any di du di yong de yare sim tu chaje shala pendu tu ya neba me ya digi rang dewa ya sim mo tu shala chawa cha digi rang du me ya dindi me du sa ne sim catch mo is semlas ta na dindi ge sim di ani marang zo lo le ya nyong ya tha ne lom sheba sa ja zo lo le ya chi le mu do wa lu de sim le du chi ko sheba se ne chi yang ga wa ro chi ko shang ra ro chi lo le sha mu do wa shang shang bo sa chi lo chi sha mu do dindiji yarveslovna yamaris samla samachidis sem rashi dones sem saadi ene rang chashar tene taksam shire mado ene number sheva sene kora teba mebe rangi yamaris shem ona ene 대접도 마세베 심지 정신이 치매 레바제 말이스 심 모투어스야디 심 주즈는 모투어 정신도 기대하지 야 말이스 모투어스야 두 모투어스야디 아니 루브루에 남도 경기 있는 모투어 차친 버레 마도 심 정신이 그 정신이 세상 직성 녀에等于되라 치매 레바 야 말이스 치매 뭐 치매는 그게 야 말이스 뜻이야.
Perhaps I will begin with a citation from a well-known scripture, Buddhist scripture, which belongs to the genre of scripture known as the perfection of wisdom. And the statement goes as following: the mind is devoid of mind because the nature of mind is clear light. So this statement, we can look at it three different aspects of the Buddhist thought on the basis of this particular statement. So the first part deals with the phenomenon that we call mind. So when we speak of mind, we are already talking about a phenomenon that is directly related to our experience of happiness and suffering, pain and pleasure. And also, for example, when we speak of the experience of pain and pleasure, suffering and happiness, we are already talking about sentient beings who have the capacity to feel these experiences. We are not talking about inanimate objects which has no capacity for experience of that kind. So directly we are talking about a phenomenon that is not material, that is experiential in their nature. So in other words, we are talking about a phenomenon known as consciousness or mind. And the key point being made here is to emphasize the importance of the role of consciousness and mind in our experience of pain and pleasure, because we all naturally aspire for happiness, seek happiness, and wish to overcome suffering. And the role of mind in that aspiration is very crucial, because according to Buddhism, suffering and pain is understood to be a function of an untamed and undisciplined mind, and happiness and joy is understood to be a function of a tamed and disciplined mind. And so that's why the first part of the statement, mind is devoid of mind, the first part of the statement emphasizes the role of mind and consciousness in our fundamental experience of happiness and suffering. The second part of the statement is mind is devoid of mind. And this part points to our understanding of mind itself. In our naive perception, we tend to feel as if there is something called mind that is somehow concrete, that is somehow real. And so what the Buddha is pointing out is that this naive assumption of there being some kind of solid thing or concrete thing called mind is a false, distorted understanding. And then the final part, which states that the nature of mind is clear light, then points towards the ultimate nature of mind. The ultimate nature of mind is a phenomenon whose reality and existence.
Ultimate nature is already conventionally.
The same Guranshi.
Conventionally,
So the final part, the nature of mind is clear light, points towards the nature of mind where its reality can only be understood in terms of dependent relations of causes and conditions. And beyond that dependent relation, one cannot posit a mind that is separate from that relationship. And furthermore, it also points to us that in its essential nature, mind is pure. Our mind is deluded, but these delusion and the pollutants of the mind are adventitious. And the pollutions of the mind, contamination, really result from kind of more thought processes and conceptual processes, which has the tendency to obscure and taint our essential nature of the mind. However, the essential nature of mind is luminosity and this mere experience, and at that level, our mind is clear light. Our mind is free of pollution. So these things are pointed out in this one statement of the Buddha, that mind is devoid of mind because the essential nature of the nature of mind is clear light.
This love show no sometimes that samla sa digi da sem tu mo dugi thane didu ya yi yin du sa ne din shi nam sha di samla sa de twa yin ya de sem ma chi de sa digi sem me be ke ma ba ta samla sem ma chi de sem de sem ge rang xin re sem yare sem tru de yare ini shi su tru yare la ina tru ya ma res sa de indu sa ne di ga la chen yi sum sa de ji ja cho yare de twan yong yare da usim ni ga lo tu mong ge zhe ya ene dong shi che jian de xe sem la xe da de ga la ga ja sem din ru xia ga ja sem din ru 대 동에 아니 semden동 준이샤 저 신이숨사 남샤지 다 동닉 남샤샤 인도산에 강기 동배 각자지 시강기 정도 동배 동시 전에 샹왕 군다 용주 사야지 무슨 니가 로다 송대도 와 패지다 디제 섬로 섬머치대 사게지 다 섬이런 신의 어서 사야지 디시 인군도 디시 인군도 임베요 전에 디나라 아니 감 디시 인부 전에 좀 마법에 섬지 춘이 점了또 마세베 심宽것 때문에 디시 인부 송도와 맞다 디송이야 돼 당나가 남샤지 되는 제용이야 돼 나가 사람들이 다 노래 조르데 다 디자르든 샤샤샤.
So to summarize what we can understand from this single statement is that the first part of the statement where Buddha says that the mind is here the importance of the role of mind is being emphasized, and since the key role of mind in determining how an undisciplined mind, an untamed mind leads to suffering, and tamed and disciplined mind leads to happiness, this cause and effect relationship is being presented. Therefore, in relation to this first part of the statement, the entire teachings of the Buddha on the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering and its origin, cause and cessation, can be related in that context of understanding the role of mind. The second part of the statement, that mind is devoid of mind, can be understood as pointing towards the ultimate nature of mind, because although we assume the mind to possess some kind of objective, independent existence of its own, but however, if you critically analyze and search for that phenomenon, then you cannot find a phenomenon that is solid, concrete, and independent of the basis upon which the phenomenon, the label mind is being applied. So here one can speak about what the middle way philosophers school and mind-only school talk about three natures of the mind. So here, when we speak about the nature of mind, so the mind itself would be the basis, and what is being negated is our imputation of mind as possessing some kind of truly substantial reality. So that is the imputed nature, and then the absence of that imputed nature on the basis, which is mind, is the emptiness nature, or the thoroughly established nature. So what it points to is that mind, which we assume to possess this real existence, is actually devoid of such substantial reality, and that absence of that substantial reality is the mind's true nature. And then the third part, because
real existence, right?
No, no, substantially real existence. No. So the third part, because the mind is clear light, the nature of mind is clear light, then can be seen as pointing towards the Buddha's teaching on the Buddha nature, the Tathagata Garbha, the essence of Buddhahood. So when we speak of this, the essence of Buddhahood, the seed of Buddhahood, it can refer both to the emptiness of mind, which is the ultimate nature, but also to the clear light nature of mind, which is a subjective quality of our mind. And it is in respect to this second part of the nature, which is the clear light nature of mind, that the Buddhist Vajrayana teachings are related. It is in the exploration and deepening of understanding of that clear light nature of mind that the Vajrayana teachings become relevant.
So, now finished. Introduction of Buddha Dharma. That the service, Dordeng service.
So this is like the summary.
That Four Noble Truths, that some of the Pali, some of the Shango Tangbu coins and the Bashis sorry. Chazanga, that the Bashis are the Kasuri Mindu Dungenche, Deba di Dawache, Dawa di Tang this Samura. Dunge de ya Dunge Dunge, so Dunge. Nanzu so Dawa, Namjunga do the Tandunia, so Dawa de Yaho Samdama in the Dunge Denge Sharia. Didn't you mean to say? Give it to me. That Diniga log, Shirudi, Lanu di Shawan Jangi, Kiawachi, my Indusane, to make the new tension in Biari. Di, to make South Richard, the news and Dujik to Miss Asha. Didn't you under data to mail a Chogu, to make the sword to make it Gomare? 동네 타다게 땡으로 정해 랭유지 샤완쟁기 딱 풍부스nem도 랭유지 샤완쟁기 깨와 진짜 이번 인도 동네도 디샤바 인도산에 대화대 디 동초기 랭유지 깨와 디 자와는 매바 차서나 다 땡도 대화래 어다 대화 들리지 샤네 소화 대회기 좀 하셔 닐린지 풍부 동네 녀월 쉬었디 대화를 시하니 딴도 대화 처리하리 다 진이부터 주저를 시 내자를 시 내서래 간다 아주 컨선이야 동네다 동네 방배 대화대 땅아주 지 아주 난가요 대화 나 그게 전당 강청부터 다 din이 차대요 다 din이부터 동해 시월 규칙 레벨 동해 매버 처리야 말이 대화 톱으로 규칙 레벨 대화 도구야 말이 Didu Nibudi Rangi, Julatane, Julatane, Chumbo Induzane, Devu Tunge Minduba Digi, Tungegi Judi Shevakone, Merso Yari. Tendo Tawadi Shevakone, Tendo Tawadi Devayina, Tendo Tawadi Dujigi, Judi, Kaim, Shevakone, Di Tangulengo Yari. Di Karjungor Slavina, Sanje, Tumumaimbe, Tawa, Tension Deborjuma said Shevre. Tendril Sadi, Alakabdi, Junjit and said Shayari. Didu Sambe, Chokanda, Georgengi, Midawaran, Chokanda Kainaya, Rangi Juda, Jan, Samlatane, any Gishin, Jibe, Tani to Judas. Other Digi, Dujet Tenjum, Junjit Tenjum, Sadi, Zawa Tita, Nambeto, Tumwing with the shot. Titane, she's a Titane, any Dabashes at the turn.
So, making that as a summary outline of Buddhism, to elaborate a little bit more, let's look at the Buddha's teaching on Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's teaching on Four Noble Truths really forms the common foundation for both the Pali and the Sanskrit tradition. And if we look at the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, we are essentially talking about a mechanism for fulfilling our basic aspiration to seek happiness and to overcome suffering. So this is really the Four Noble Truths, teachings on the Four Noble Truths really pertain to this fundamental concern of all sentient beings, that is to naturally aspire for happiness and to seek to overcome suffering. So when we use the such language as seeking to overcome suffering in the Buddhist context, we need to have a deeper understanding of what is meant by suffering in this particular context. Generally in Buddhism, a distinction is made between three levels of suffering. One is the suffering of suffering, that is the evident suffering of our pain and so on, which we all conventionally recognize as painful experiences and suffering. So that is at the level of feeling and sensation. Then there is a second level of suffering known as the suffering of change, and this includes even those experiences which we conventionally identify as pleasurable and joyful, and they are referred to as suffering because they have a tendency, if you indulge in them for too long, they have a tendency to lead on to dissatisfaction and further suffering. So therefore they are recognized as suffering. And then there's the third level of suffering, which is known as the suffering of conditioning, pervasive conditioning. And this refers to our fundamental fact of existing in a conditioned way, our conditioned existence based upon affliction. And this fundamental fact of our existence is recognized as suffering because it is at the root of the first two levels of suffering. So in the Buddhist context, a practitioner, when he or she aspires for attaining happiness and wish to overcome suffering, the suffering that he or she wishes to overcome is really at this fundamental, root level of suffering. And therefore, the happiness that is being sought in the context of the teachings of the Four Noble Truths refers to direct opposite of that suffering. And the direct opposite of that suffering is the state of cessation, where all the root sufferings have come to an end. Not just the suffering, but also the causes and conditions that lead to that suffering that has come to an end. And this is what is meant by aspiring to seek happiness and aspiring to seek to overcome suffering in the context of a Buddhist practitioner. So, and now, in engaging in such a kind of an aspiration, it is not adequate then to make the prayer, make the aspiration, may all sufferings come to an end, may I attain the true freedom that is happiness. Making such aspiration alone is not adequate. What is required is to understand the causal mechanism and relations, that causes and conditions that lead to suffering that we wish to overcome. What are the and on the basis of that understanding, one needs to avoid creating these causes and conditions, and also one need to look into the causes and conditions that would lead to this ultimate happiness that we are seeking for, and on the basis of that understanding one must cultivate those causes and conditions, and it is on that basis one needs to fulfill that basic aspiration of seeking happiness and overcome suffering. So what this tells us, illustrate, is a fundamental philosophical principle in Buddhism, which is the principle of dependent origination. Because in Buddhism, the key philosophical idea really is the understanding of the evolution and emergence of everything in terms of their causes and conditions alone. And it is through the aggregation and coming together of causes and conditions that events come into being. And so this points to the Buddha's teaching on pratitha samuppada, dependent origination, particularly in terms of causes and conditions.
Time. Tadi kasa ta kunju tamba slavyundu ta onde tangela tiri dizuna chumden de tenshi sumbe kaduliya tenshi ngol daba sa de shi ne su sumburisha tende da shi ne tende jres tene tenshi chawal daba slavyuzane ta shi ne su tende jibe induzane ene ngarazo 동네 메드바다 대원 되거리 근데 인도 아니 랑도는 죽도 독쳐거래 디소 대지 자원 레보도 잡을 대바스레비잖아요 다 대대비 아니 랑도는 죽도 제베이나 제부 컨디션 그래스lam나 아니 동네 셔버시다 동네 군중 자원에 봐 매버 차연도 동네 라 셔버샤 군중 라 방차 요 말이스 고봉도 차요 고봉도 셔 심벌이 람 고벌 차요 람 고 심벌이 전에 도센다 somebody 근데 이 전에 산제베 최디 미지 나 최냠는 신에게 땡조디 밀루차되어래 가라슬로는 최디 최도 남지기 싫어 그 타네 냠내치야지 소 차용을 인도산에 최도 남지기 싫어 다 약실지 미루된데 근데 이 인도산에 미루된 거 타라스 다 랑도디도 세자 냠내치니 다 거봐 용 쏘버지 다 쳐야지 송교아리 근데 이 인도 고조서디 미지 미 탐해봐 전대지 아니 림기야 denshi langdong yugdo shayni tardu ini domain nyawar shiwe nishi yingmodu chaya chidu hajirda Buddhism shadi a kind of humanism sigdowa di pachi lawchor chay miji yados kasorida da chikhaja lawon dili soji lawto choga sorido miji tamebe miji tara ini da 야 타방건도 제봤으니 타방건도 제하다 터두다 남경건도 제하슬도 미지 군조 찾아보도 산제베 군조 찾아보도 야유되지 자장가 테스틱 디디야 테스틱 슐루디리 군조 내 마도스다 밀마주 되지 안된 낭배셔디 노다나도 때문에 그 미지 림베치는 컨트상게 오고 디셔야 되지 도와 어느 상제의 최디 상제의 송을 봐 마초 말베슬라베이나 상제 좀데도 코로나에 대고 투무원도 제베이나 얘네 토마니 가갈이야 가다 도와주는 거 봐도 사마제 봐도 심전 차디요 전주서 소스디오 차디요 전에 도와주잖아요 뭐 봐도 상제는 잡아서 구시等于个상제 셰베 이나야 거라 탐에다 남아서 땡 거야 그 둠젠디 미직야 산제 거야 지금 인도잖아요 둠제 디차네 뒤던도 봐 당군데 거라면 산제라가 남을 당군데 땡이잖아 저거 봐 고사도 산제는 잡아 누가 고사도 산제는 잡아야 돼미 탐해버지기 산제고 봐 두다 다디 땡도 봐.
So now when we look at the way in which Buddha actually taught the Four Noble Truths, in the scriptures we see that Buddha repeated the statements of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering in its origin and the cessation and the path that leads to that cessation. First, Buddha identified what are those four truths, what is suffering, what is the origin of suffering, and what is the possibility of a cessation, what are the paths that would lead to that cessation. And by speaking of the specific natures of these Four Noble Truths, the Buddha in a sense set out our understanding of the nature of reality, how cause and effects play in this reality. And in the second level, Buddha talked about the functions of these understanding of the Four Noble Truths, the nature of the Four Noble Truths. And the function here is how, on the basis of the understanding of this nature of reality, as an individual, how should an individual go about implementing that knowledge into a day-to-day life and living an ethical and spiritual way of life. And then the third aspect that the Buddha spoke about on the teaching of the Four Noble Truths is how, by applying these functions of the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, what kind of results that the individual practitioner would achieve. And here Buddha made statements such as suffering must be recognized. So the first, he said, this is the truth of suffering. With respect to the second, the function, he said, suffering must be understood or recognized. That's the function. And with respect to the purpose and the fruit result, he said, although suffering is to be understood and recognized, but there is no suffering to be understood and recognized. So what he is talking about here is that once you have, as a result of applying your knowledge of the nature of suffering and lived an ethically sound way of life and attained the result, then there is no more further suffering to be recognized and eliminated. So if you look at the way in which the Buddha taught, first of all, the nature of suffering, nature of the Four Noble Truths, the functions of the Four Noble Truths, and the fruits of the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths and the practices based upon that, what we see here is a fundamental pattern that is and that reflect the understanding of the stages of the path within the Buddhist tradition. So here what we see is in the Buddha's teaching a pattern of a journey of an individual from the starting point of an ordinary human state. And here the human existence is really seen as the ideal physical existence to engage in the Buddhist path, because Buddhist path and practice involve maximum utilization of human intelligence, and therefore human existence is really seen as the ideal bodily existence to engage in the Buddhist path. So what we see here is a pattern of a journey, spiritual journey, where starting from the individual ordinary human state through a progressively more awakened state, ultimately culminating in the attainment of full liberation as well as including full awakening of Buddhahood. So when you look at it in this way, there is some truth in some people when they characterize Buddhism as a form of humanism, because it essentially presents a path that unfolds from an individual ordinary human state to an enlightened state. And this is quite different from the basic pattern of a spiritual path and the evolution of the spiritual teaching in the theistic traditions. In the theistic tradition, the fundamental origin of the spiritual teachings is a form of a revelation coming from a transcendent being. From there is a kind of a more top-down evolution, whereas in the Buddhist spirituality, the evolution is more from bottom up, from the level of an individual, ordinary human being to an awakened state. Now, of course, one can raise a question saying that even in the case of Buddhism, Buddhist spirituality, aren't the teaching, the paths themselves taught by an enlightened being, the Buddha, in other words, the Buddha, the historical Buddha? Here, of course, a common understanding that is shared by, one perspective that is commonly shared between the Theravadins and the non-Theravadins is that up until the point when Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, Buddha was a bodhisattva, a sentient being, and under the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, Buddha attained full awakening. That marks transcendence from an ordinary human being to an awakened, fully awakened Buddha. But even in the case of Mahayana perspective, where the historical Buddha, even from birth, is already seen as a manifestation of someone who had already attained the embodiment of the four kayas, the four Buddha bodies. Even here, one will have to recognize that the Buddha's deed of attaining enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya has a special significance, because the significance here is to illustrate to the followers of the Buddha that the Buddhist path has to be is a journey from a state of ordinary human being to an awakened state of full Buddhahood.
Logic Sina, any two sung Sanja Tanjalo, and a Sosukyo Jineas, any Zimki Lamkon Sanjo, Shada.
In fact, there is a statement in one of the sutras, scriptures, which states that all the Buddhas of the three times are and will be Buddhas who were initially ordinary sentient beings who, through the journey, became fully enlightened.
Ta Damba Sumba Gogwe Damba Sadeade, Ta the Tagilabdeage, Ta Tunge Lara Kent Chanaya, Kim Mirundu Chedea. Dindigi Nego Chita, Yontuya Yotame, sing Dishiki Hare. Nella Tungeji Tunge Pa Tanto Paya Chick. Then Gyo Tunge Paya, that Turdurute, Duji Tunge, Tanto Paya Chick. That this Samdayalia, Nella Tunge Yukangi Chidua, that's some down. Tunge di Yukangi Chidua, some time to Zane, Tunge Gunjung Satimbare. Ta Gunjung and Lagi Kunju, the Yumube Kunju, Nishani, Zozo de Yumube Kunju Chariari. Last Yadi, Chiri Kunjig, Tenji said, Dean Nangse. Chebabuchiki, Gunungi, Zawata, Gunungi, Chabadan Devakone, Gujin Sato to Shabachilla, less yard. Tinde lady, Gunungi, Chabadan Devakone, Sasha Jimbe, so let's all the dependent, let's all the Lumatic Lakasha consciente, Penuding led to Teddy, Gunungi, Chabadan Devatone, Sasha Jim, Kuiba Indusane, that Gunung Negate, Cash Chavia. That in our Numo said the Ligiari. Takada Tungen Rujigi, Dudi, Tunge Yungi, Shave Tane, Tunge Jume, the Yumarba. Penat Tungi Dunga Chashana. Tunge Tunge, Tinduji Sonama in Bella, say di Tunge Dene, Tunge Tunge Dene, Saw Tunge Dene. Let us talk as Sujimarba. Co Jundelia, the Casuripe, Simiruchan, Junde Yamar Saro, Dendegi, Mongo Chik Wangi, that landed Mongo said, D Wangi, Sonamain Belasani, don't you doing to the only doa. Dia 가수를 대기세야데 샹라 팬드드는 연구를 동해세야데 샹라 너바치는 연구를 해야게 규든 레벨 남샤디 시 규든 레벨 남샤들로 몽고디 멤버체 레디인에 다라 착배 다차 다도 즈바 된대기 착배 관계 레사니 윤두잔에 해질 다디 연대게 가사 주부디 개회를 되지 과변적이다 미유엘라이네리 소남글라이네리 배도 수준주래 자들이 인도산에 가다 동해지 동해도 교회 동해 누지기 동해 생각이 영향하게 그게 레사야게 사회 군우야 또 인도산에 랜드를 뭐 말이고 대자로 투서디 대코나니는 뭐 말이고 대왕게 레지도 사유고요 배지 세우도가 다 대코는 일로 몸에 머리고 써야지 매소 투야 여드메 디 매소 투야 여나 대왕의 사실에 레디디 도토그레 대왕의 제부 동해수부터 도토그레 그래서 진짜 인도 다 투서디 대코는 일로 몸에 머리고 써야지 세 투야 여드메 써야지 삼당고요 아래 다디 냐라 몽버지 인더메스야디 로티 지드르 샴번너시 턴을 내여나 몽버 말봐 그 지다 그 가서 그런 거인네 지면시 리그를 봐 사마봐 로튼들 다 머리고 쓰자네 턴 지면시 미시바 양나 친지로도 떠고 지리야 스티거로 봐 자들이 이마 인도산에 대코나니로 몽버 머리고 쓰자네 그 친지로도 떠고 소데 치질로 또 똑바로 쓰게 하래. 드리인도 로테 지도 소원의 전은 내 여명을 심주체니. 대내 신에 대다스 준비 로테 아니 치질로 로인데면 탁주쳐 봐. 드리인도 다 다음에와 사다 디가 레고요 하래. 다음에 따와 사디가 레고요 하래. 나 다음에 따와 샤인도산에 남괴 좀 되나 로리야 차라 먹고 좋은데다 그 차라 서울에 다리 14를 차라 먹고지 되는 거야 아래 다 안돼 되는 거 하고 루주 나도다 루주가 전장 소지고 그래 자 드리면 인도산에 다 전의 정신이 두도 못 주사 다 대가 상다래 머리고 소디 정신이 두번 점을 놓지 정신이 두번 점을 놓지 머리고 인다면 친일로 인다면 해야 돼 정신이 두려면 가는 자주지고 다와디 아니 동리사야 되가 말레용게 동리가 다와사야 되가 레용게 아래 다디 십제제 셰견야디 콜로 담불거든 셰견야 말에 콜로 발베거로 섬라 섬머치데사 디거로 단 데셔터용게 아래 섬런 신기 동아레스 섬 코랑게 네루스도야 말레스 섬게 인루 제용보이나 섬디 니그 말에 셈 가서 최신 셈게 나와도 봐 가네 셈 아니 가서 우리 그게 런신기 동점지 그 취니디 니용그레스 뜻은 것도가 셈라 셈머치데 사디 셈머치데 사디 그래서 내가 이번 인도산에 따와 동니가 따와 달아봐야 돼 다 디터네 셈이야 지 최남 그때 어다 동번이 임베 정신이 주가 동의 경쟁디 때에 딱과래도 와서 다 대기가 더 경쟁이 된중 대래 다처를 신체 때는 중에 된중 삼모인 거 때는 딱배 된중사 대간의 셴거래 때는 딱과 인상 때문에 라왕 주어 말했어 때문에 라왕 주어지 담배 뒤시게요래 그 때는 주어 인도산에 때는 딱배고는 주어 인상 그 라왕 주어지 요 말했어 라왕 주어 요 말인데 이내 라왕 주어도 낭신 나왔다도 셴벨로티 머리버들레스 되시고 저들이 머리가 신유 순충 투야지 다 담이 주식이 이거 뒤에 되게 머리가 신유 가요도 다 동시에는 거든 조용 거야.
So, talking about suffering and its origin, and the third, particularly the third noble truth, which is the truth of cessation. So, the truth of so what we need to do as practitioners is to really inquire into the very question of the possibility of attaining such a cessation. So, what we mean by cessation is a state where even when you are confronted with the causes and conditions that would normally lead to afflictions and give rise to suffering, a cessation refers to a state where you will not, these causes and conditions which would otherwise lead to suffering and afflictions would not have the power to create afflictions and sufferings anymore. So that is the truth of cessation. And so when we talk about the cessation, we're talking about the cessation of the suffering. And already we spoke about three different levels of suffering: the evident, obvious suffering of our sensations, and the suffering of change, and suffering of pervasive conditioning, which is the more fundamental level of suffering. So by engaging in the path and living an ethically sound way of life, one will be able to gradually eliminate the causes and conditions that would give rise to these three levels of suffering, beginning with preventing the causes and conditions for the evident, more obvious sufferings, and then the suffering of change and so on. And so when we look, so what becomes important is to inquire into the causes and conditions that lead to these degrees of suffering. So this immediately takes us to the understanding the second truth, which is the truth of origin of suffering. So generally, when we speak of the origin of suffering, we are talking about two primary factors here. One is the karmic actions, volitional, intentional actions, and the afflictions, which are the basis from which these actions arise. And between these two, the principal origin of suffering really are the afflictions. So whereas when we talk about karmic action, we are really talking about a subset of the larger cause and effect events. So what is unique about the karmic causation is the involvement of a sentient being and his or her intention. So when intention gets involved into a chain of causation, a new chain of causation is created, and that new chain of causation is referred to the karmic causation. So it's really a subset of the wider cause and effect processes. And so the karmic, so most of the important actions that we engage in that really matters, that has significant consequences, tend to be actions that are driven by intentions or motivation. So, and it is the motivation and the intention that determines the quality of the actions that we engage in. So when we talk about the motivation, we are already talking at the level of our states of mind that give rise to these actions. And here, the afflictions have a very important role in creating the intention and the motivations that we have. And so, and at the root of all of these afflictions is really ignorance, because there is not a single sentient being that would willfully, knowingly create the causes and conditions for his or her own suffering. Because our basic aspiration is to aspire for happiness and to wish to overcome suffering. So all our activities are really driven by that fundamental aspiration. But so we still continue to experience suffering and suffering because somewhere there is an ignorance involved of the causal conditions that give rise to suffering and the pain. And here, when we speak of ignorance, there can be different types of ignorance. The ignorance with respect to the karmic law of cause and effect, and also even this ignorance, sometimes we may be aware of what are the causal relations of an intentional act and its consequences, yet still we can continue to create conditions for suffering because there is a deeper level of ignorance, which is not just related to the causation, but also based upon a distorted understanding of our own experience, our own existence. And this is referred to as the ignorance pertaining to the nature of our own reality. So in other words, much of our actions are kind of driven by, at a very fundamental level, are grasping at a false sense of selfhood, some kind of concrete self. And therefore, if one is interested in the project of attaining freedom from suffering, it becomes crucial to understand whether or not there is a possibility of getting rid of that fundamental ignorance. And it is in this context the Buddha's teaching on the no-self, anatman, becomes important, because it is only by cultivating that insight into the true nature of self, which is no-self, that one will be able to undo this fundamental ignorance. So when we speak of ignorance, we are talking about a state of mind that is either a mere form of unknowing, just ignorance, simple ignorance, or we are talking about a state of mind that is a distorted form of knowing. And therefore, we are talking about a state of mind whose perspective is contrary to the actual reality. So if that is the case, then at least in principle, this suggests a possibility of removing that ignorance, because it is a distorted form of knowing which is contrary to the actual reality. There is a possibility, by cultivating its opposite perspective, which is a correct perspective on reality, one may be able to eliminate this ignorance. And here, the teaching on no-self becomes crucial. So when we speak of the Buddha's teaching on no-self, of course, within the Buddhist tradition, there are different interpretation of the Buddha's teaching on no-self, various levels of subtlety. And the main primary interpretation of the Buddha's teaching on no-self that we shall be following here is that of Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna, according to Nagarjuna, the full understanding of no-self can arise on the basis of understanding all phenomena and being devoid of inherent intrinsic reality, objective independent reality. And so therefore the Buddhist teaching on no-self thus become directly related to the teaching on emptiness, the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness. And so when you understand how the teaching on emptiness is relevant to this concern of seeking to end suffering and its causes, and then we will see that that the teaching on emptiness has a great significance. And when we talk about the Buddha's teaching on emptiness, the full explanation of emptiness is not found in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, but rather in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, which includes teachings such as the perfection of wisdom, and including the statement that I cited right at the beginning of this talk, that the mind is devoid of mind because the essential nature of mind, the nature of mind is clear light. So what this point is, a further level of understanding of Buddha's teaching on dependent origination. Earlier, we understood the teaching on dependent origination only at the level of cause and effect relations and cause and effect dependent relations. Now here, when we bring the teaching on emptiness, we can understand the dependent origination also on the basis of mutuality of dependence, where the concepts are mutually defined on the basis of each other. And in this way, the understanding of the principle of dependent origination becomes much more extensive. It's not confined only to the conditioned phenomena, but it embraces the entire spectrum of all phenomena. And so in this way, if you understand, then you will understand that all phenomena are not only dependently originated, but also they are dependently designated. Therefore, none of them possess any independent identity of their own or independent existence of their own. And their existence can only be posited on the basis of a dependent relation. So therefore, because they are devoid of independent identity and existence, they are devoid of any substantial reality, and the state of mind that perceives them to possess such intrinsic objective existence will therefore be distorted, and by eliminating that distorted state of mind, which is ignorance, one will there be able to attain the true cessation. So it is in this way the teaching on emptiness and no self becomes directly related to the teaching on cessation, the Buddha's the third noble truth.
Yeah. 다 대대의 동해 여러 시에 니시인 그 곡된 대다 또 사무스타요나 영시부지 해지디 영설에 사버지 다 연두자네 다디 탑지기 탑려야 럭부여래 다 될려야네 람 거버차 소야다 디임버래 자 다데 람조 상동스디 거버시스디 동유도베 아니 시라송지기 다 시르트 송고야래 다음에도 시라송지기다 너는 지도도베다 항동 다 디게고야래 대영원래야 심지지게 삼댕 러버디 고야래 대영원래야 수중 러버 고야래 달에는 러버 숨신 송고야래 러버 숨 남냠린 제베 타네 아니 림베기 아니 람지 템보 고마디 파괴 람리 파괴 이시 등원도 제네 아니 방자 가요 롱어지 뭐지 년부 제네 아니 방자를 매매매매 받아 산거야 다들
So
다 방자 세트야 예배다 두지 개체직이 semranshi yu esawa se sungdeya di sem chime leba chenshi bayi na kadu yu na ya ene sem ma se bodu chima saya nebe so shita sem chisi nebe rinja chima na ya shaba yi na ene sem ki gyun di la denge ine chima mebe chigi nege chigi ene sha ma shima chagirwa so 다 chime chedi sem motu chenge chime chadi luburu re chebe luburu be dendi deru re sigare deru imbadi ko chijilo to ba shime indu sane chijilo lo chi yin shinjala ko 가수를 전나마 될래 거봐 치지로 또 되는 게 인도 전나마 코 시간 걸로지 그뒤네 용대 그러 봐. 그래서 이제 인도산에 치지로 걸로지는 될래 못 담대 그뒤네 여버려도 와. 다른 게 줄을 못 담대 게마지래 마도 신 지르니 못 담대지 여러고. 그래서 이제 이번 인도산에 랑게 줄을 못 담대 게 돼야 돼. 사회 랑게 시베 세리기 균삼데 주머째도 게가 말이지. 자다 세리기 셰베 균지 때문에 아니 김맹년 못덤된지 세리기 셰베 디 때문에 샤르투나 아니 세리기 셰베 때문에 몽베 왕기 게셰베 추벨로 스네면도 모두로 디디 나마차토레스 와다 동스체니 아니 람지 때마 ቋ네 코네 콘도 아니 로야다 베토레 스타디송레
So with respect to the truth of cessation, as a result of reflecting deeply on the manner in which our fundamental ignorance distorts our perception of reality and how our fundamental perception, this ignorance really is not in tune with the actual reality, and how this fundamental ignorance serves as the basis of all the afflictions and the attendant sufferings that it gives rise to, when one becomes comes to a point where one can see, at least in principle, the possibility of bringing about such a cessation, then one needs to seek the ways and means by which that cessation can be actualized and attained. And here, of course, the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path, becomes relevant. So when the Buddha speaks about, therefore, when the Buddha says, therefore, cultivate the path, actualize the cessation and cultivate the path, he's talking about the path that would lead to such cessation. So in the context of the Four Noble Truths, the principal path that is being cultivated is a deep insight into the nature of ultimate reality, where there is a synergy between a tranquil state of mind, a calm abiding, and a deep insight into the nature of reality. So there is a combination of tranquil mental state and an insight. However, in order to cultivate that principal path, one must first establish the basis, which is an ability to retain one's focus of mind single-pointedly on a chosen object. So here, therefore, one needs to cultivate the concentration, qualities of concentration. And in order to cultivate such qualities of concentration, one must ground one's way of life in a sound morality and observe the basic laws of morality. And so therefore, the Buddha taught in actual practice of the path, he taught what are known as the three higher trainings in morality, higher trainings in concentration, and higher training in wisdom. And so it is therefore by engaging in the practices of these higher trainings, one will be able to actualize the path, cultivate the path, and then actualize the cessation. So then the question is, why is such a cessation possible? One of the fundamental reason for this is, as explained before, the essential nature of mind is pure. Although our mind is diluted, but the pollutants of the mind are adventitious because our essential nature of the mind is this mere luminosity and experience, and at that level the mind is pure. And since all the pollutants of the mind that obscure and afflict our mind arise as a result of accidental or occasional conceptual processes, including the afflictions, one can see that by penetrating into the ultimate nature of reality and seeing through the deception of our fundamental ignorance, one can remove these. Because if our essential nature of mind itself is diluted, then there is no real hope. Because so long as we possess mind, we will possess a diluted mind, and we can never envision the possibility of a continuity of mind that is free of these pollutants. However, according to Buddhism, the essential nature of mind is pure, and it's mere clear light, and the pollutants that obscure mind really arises from these conceptualization and afflictions, and all of which are rooted in this fundamental ignorance. So therefore, by removing this fundamental ignorance, the whole processes that give rise to these adventitious pollutions can be removed. And in this way, one will be able to actualize the true cessation that one is aspiring for. And therefore, the fourth noble truth was taught, which is cultivate the path, cultivate the true path.
Then Tantrayana, I think one special, the unique thing about Tantrayana practice is make distinction, grosser level of mind and energy, and subtle level of mind and energy, make distinction. Then the subtle mind, usually the grosser level of mind, active. The subtle mind remain inactive. So try to subdue the grosser level of mind, so that the subtle mind then become active. So then the subtle mind transform into the wisdom which understands Shunya. So that's unique thing about Tantrayana. So 10:31. Finish.